In 793 AD, Norse warriors landed on the island of Lindisfarne and burned a monastery to the ground. Europe called them monsters, pagans, barbarians who ate raw flesh and knew nothing of civilization. Here is what the archaeological record actually shows. In Norse communities, meat, fish, fermented dairy, and preserved food appeared at the table, with a regularity that would have seemed extraordinary to a French peasant or an English serf of the same era. These were not people eating at random. They were people who had developed sophisticated methods of fermentation, preservation, and ritual that modern science is only now beginning to fully understand. They built a food culture so resilient that it crossed 1,000 years and arrived in your supermarket. The superfood your nutritionist recommended last month? The word in your language for a romantic holiday? The fermentation techniques behind some of the world's most celebrated cuisine? All of it traces back to the people Europe called barbarians. This is what the Vikings actually ate, and why it never stopped feeding the world.
Wait, plus these so-called barbarians had fermented dairy, cured fish, and they basically invented the honeymoon. My ancestors were running a health food store with a mead bar.
The foundation of the Viking diet was simple, practical, and deeply communal, built around the hearth at the center of the longhouse. The scouse, a thick stew of meat, fish, root vegetables, and grain, simmered in a soapstone pot over the central fire. When the family ate, new ingredients were added. The pot was rarely empty. The fire was rarely cold. The stew was the heartbeat of the household. 2 meals per day, the dagmol, day meal, eaten an hour after rising, often yesterday's stew with dark bread and dried fruit. The natmal, night meal, after a full day of farming, fishing, or sailing, heavier and richer, shaped by what the season allowed. Dark bread from rye and barley, stockfish, cod dried in cold Arctic air until it became hard as wood and lasted for years at sea. Butter, cheese, and the fermented dairy that was the true engine of Norse nutrition. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, horns became drinking vessels, skin became clothing. The entire animal served the family, long after the meat was gone. In a climate where winter could kill, waste was not just inefficiency, it was a form of self-destruction. Here is something that will change how you think about your breakfast. The thick, high-protein, low-fat fermented dairy product sold in supermarkets across the world today, marketed as a modern health food, a nutritional discovery, a product of contemporary food science, preserves a food tradition that reaches back deep into the Norse world. More than 1,000 years ago, Skyr was made by fermenting skimmed milk with specific bacterial cultures that were kept alive across generations, passed from mother to daughter, as family inheritance, as precious as land or livestock. Each family's Skyr carried its own microbial signature, refined over decades of care. It was cheap, it was nutritious, it was available year-round, and it traveled well on ships, which made it critical to Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. Icelandic settlers brought their Skyr cultures with them when they left Scandinavia in the 9th century. Those same cultures have been maintained in Iceland for over 1,000 years. The next time you open a container of Icelandic yogurt in a modern supermarket, you are eating something shaped by Norse hands. In the year 900 AD, the tradition has barely changed. Only the packaging is new. In the Norse world, preservation was not a side skill. It was survival turned into technique. The climate of Scandinavia and Iceland imposed a brutal constraint. Anything that could not be stored through winter could not be eaten in winter, and winter lasted half the year. The solution was fermentation, a technology so effective, so sophisticated, and so deeply embedded in Norse daily life that it shaped not just what they ate, but who they were. Fish were dried, salted, and fermented. Meat was cured and aged. Dairy was soured and fermented into Skyr, butter and aged cheese. Grain was fermented into ale and bread, with a sharp, complex flavor that would be unrecognizable to anyone raised on modern commercial yeast. The tradition of fermenting shark, still practiced in Iceland today as hakal, is one of the most extreme examples of this philosophy, carried to its logical conclusion. The Greenland shark is toxic when fresh. Through a months-long process of burial, pressing, and drying, the toxins are expelled and the flesh becomes edible. It is not a comfortable food, but it is a testament to what a culture will learn to do when the alternative is starvation. Fermentation did not just preserve, it transformed. It made the toxic safe, the inedible nutritious. And in doing so, it created a flavor culture that still echoes through Nordic cuisine today. Not everyone could afford mead, and that was precisely the point. Mjóeda, the Old Norse word for mead, was a fermented drink made from honey, water, and wild herbs. Simple in ingredients, immense in meaning. Honey was expensive and difficult to obtain in northern climates. A single hive required months of tending or dangerous wild harvesting. To offer mead to a guest was to offer something rare, something that said, "You are worth this." The mead hall was the center of Norse social life, where stories were told, alliances sealed, oaths sworn before witnesses. The Sumbul ritual. Participants drank in turns from a shared horn, each making a vow or telling a story before passing it on. The drinking was not entertainment, it was ceremony, and the language around marriage may preserve an echo of that world. One of the most widely cited explanations for the word honeymoon connects it to the old northern association between marriage, honey, and mead, the tradition of giving newlyweds enough mead for 1 full month after the wedding. Whether the etymology is certain or not, the symbolism survived because it was true to something people recognized. Honey, mead, marriage, time. The Vikings understood that the most important things in life deserved to be marked with the most precious things on the table.
So let me get this straight. Every romantic honeymoon in modern history is basically a Viking drinking tradition that survived 1,000 years. You're welcome, humanity.
In Norse society, the table told you everything you needed to know about a person. The Jarl, the Norse lord, feasted on imported wine from Francia, exotic spices, traded along routes that stretched from Scandinavia to Baghdad, roasted meats, elaborate stews, and fresh bread. His table was a statement of power, reach, and connection to the wider world. The Bondi, the free farmer, built meals around meat, fish, dark bread, Skyr, and ale. The archaeological record suggests that access to animal protein was considerably more common in Norse farming communities than in many comparable medieval European societies. The food did not match the Jarl's table, but it sustained bodies built for hard physical work across brutal climates. The thrall, the slave, ate what remained: grain, dried fish, the minimum required to work and survive. 3 tables, 3 diets, 3 lives. Food did not simply reflect the hierarchy, it helped enforce it. What you ate told everyone around you exactly who you were and who you would always be. 3 times a year, the Norse community gathered for something larger than a meal. The Blót, meaning sacrifice, meaning worship through offering, was the central religious ceremony of Norse paganism. Animals were brought to the sacred space at major seasonal sacrifices. Blood played a central ritual role, and the communal feast that followed bound the community together, to the gods, to the harvest, to the memory of the dead. 3 Blóts anchored the Norse year, beginning of winter for abundance through the dark months. Midwinter for the crops to come in spring, the season of expeditions, for victory in the voyages ahead, each one a negotiation between the living and the divine, each one sealed with shared food and drink, the first goblet for Odin, for victory, the second for Njord and Freyr, for peace and harvest, the third for the ancestors, for those who had gone before, and whose favor the living still needed. The meal was not just nourishment, it was a contract, a promise made across the boundary between the human and the sacred. But the most intimate ritual was not the great public blot. It happened inside the home, in private, led by the woman of the house. The Alfblót, the sacrifice to the elves and ancestors, appears in the sources as a more domestic, family-centered ceremony, held in late autumn as winter approached. Where the great blot was public and communal, the Alfblót was closed and intimate. Travelers were turned away at the door, a striking act in a culture where hospitality was sacred law. Offerings of food, mead, and grain were prepared for the spirits of the families dead. Ancestors believed to watch over the living from beneath the farmstead itself, protecting the crops, guarding the children, ensuring the land remained fertile, and the remembrance goblet, passed among the living, drunk in honor of those who were gone. In the Norse worldview, the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall. It was a threshold. And at the Alfblót, the threshold was crossed, if only for an evening, by the smell of food and the taste of mead, prepared specifically for those who could no longer eat. The Viking Age ended roughly 1,000 years ago. The long ships rotted. The mead halls fell silent. The Blóts gave way to Christian mass. But some of what the Norse built did not disappear. It adapted. Skyr, still produced in Iceland, using traditions rooted in the Norse world, now sold globally as a modern health food. Gravlax on menus in every Nordic-inspired restaurant on Earth. The fermentation techniques that Norse communities refined across centuries became the foundation of the culinary renaissance that made Scandinavian cuisine one of the world's most respected. And in language, echoes survive that most people never notice. The word honeymoon, the concept of the communal table as a site of obligation and ceremony, the understanding, deeply Nordic in its origins, that what you eat together matters as much as what you eat alone. The Vikings did not just raid and trade. They preserved, fermented, ritualized, and remembered. And in doing so, they left a food culture so resilient that 1,000 years of history could not erase it. It only carried it further. They called them barbarians, men without culture, without refinement, without civilization. But these were people who understood preservation, nourishment, seasonality, and ritual with a sophistication that their contemporaries across the Channel could not match, who built a food culture capable of sustaining 1,000-mile ocean voyages in open boats, who created fermented dairy that modern nutritional science would one day classify as one of the healthiest foods on Earth, who connected every meal to the cosmos, to the gods above, and the ancestors below. Every meal had meaning. Every drink carried obligation. Every feast was a bridge between the world of the living and the world of those who had gone before. We call them barbarians. They were feeding their gods. If this episode changed how you see the past, subscribe. Because next episode, we cross the Atlantic. We go to a civilization that built the largest empire in the Americas without a single iron tool, a written language, or a wheel, and their food will leave you speechless.
If this episode changed how you see the Vikings, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because next episode we leave the Longhouse behind. We go to space, and we ask a question nobody thinks about. What do you eat when there is no gravity, no refrigerator, and no way home for 6 months? The answer will surprise you. Eaten by time, next episode.